Hi everybody, this is Mr. Williams. What I'd like to do with this online lesson is to take you through a lot of the things that people believed in and changed and improvements they made during the 19th century. Have a look at improvements in medicine and public health and also look at some of the problems and how they were overcome to some degree in surgery. Okay, and towards the end we'll be looking at how you can answer specific exam questions, helping with your exam technique. I'll be looking at this top 11 people and events during the course of this PowerPoint, and I've arranged these into chronological order. So it may be slightly different to how you were taught, how you see it in your book, but I felt that this was the best way for you to see how things improved during the 19th century. Starting with Edward Jenner all the way up to the Public Health Act of 1875. Even though there were lots of other things in between these things, and that came afterwards, I'm just going to concentrate on this top 11. You may have this revision grid for you to fill in as well. You can fill it in as we go along, or you can just listen to the whole thing and then come back and use this online lesson. Or indeed, you can just listen to the lesson, let it all just go in, and then later on go back through your book, through your notes. Even if you've got a revision guide, go through that as well. But in particular, what we're looking for you to fill in, and it probably says at the top, I can't quite read it there, that you should be filling in at least 5 to 10 bits of information, features, for you to write as evidence in a Peel paragraph. But very important to fill in the bit about why each event, each person, each improvement was important too, because at some point you'll have to write a paragraph that says this was important because, or this was an improvement because, that kind of thing. Okay. Right, first of all, we're going to look at, well, going back to the 18th century, actually, just before the 19th started, of course. At the time, now actually, we all get vaccinated. From the moment you're born, you probably don't know this, but you've been having vaccinations against various diseases, okay? Originally, going back to the end of the 18th century, there was only one thing around, and it was called inoculation. The big killer at the time was smallpox, and we had no protection against it. The pox killed millions of people around the world every year, okay? But Lady Wortley Montagu, I think she was the ambassador's wife or daughter in Turkey, had seen this thing being done at a thing called a smallpox party. And children would be brought along and they'd all have a little scratch put on them, and scabs and pus, nice, from somebody who had smallpox would just be put in to them. They'd get ill, recover, and nobody really understood what this did or how it worked, and they'd never get smallpox again. That was the idea. Now we know that what they developed was a thing called immunity. White blood cells in the future recognized that this disease was coming and attacked it and stopped it. Okay. Smallpox, like I said, was a real killer, and this is probably the nicest picture I could find to show you smallpox lesions or spots, that kind of thing, okay? And it was pretty fatal, you know. You had a very big chance of dying if you caught it. And these are the kind of things you have to look out for: abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, headaches, backache, feeling just unwell, hot and sweaty, and of course this horrible rash all over the skin, and they'd fill up with blood and pus and, you know, fall off and leave these pox scars behind. You've probably heard the phrase pocked marked skin. That's what it is, where somebody's had a big spot and it's healed or dropped off and healed and left this kind of crater behind. Elizabeth I, when she became queen, not soon after developed smallpox and nearly died. Okay, it's one of those what if things in history. So like I said, the inoculation process that was introduced was very dangerous. You could still actually catch the, what can we call it, the full-blown version of smallpox and die yourself, or be left deaf or unable to speak. Edward Jenner, who we'll look at in just a moment, when he was a lad, he went through this process, and I think there was 4 or 5 of them, and he emerged. I think one of them died and one of them was left deaf. So yeah, no thanks. Yeah, a very dangerous, very risky process. Okay. And here's a description from the time about an old woman coming in with a bit of smallpox, cuts the skin open with a knife or a needle, puts in this smallpox matter, you know, crushed up scabs and pus, that kind of stuff, lovely, and then, you know, sit back and wait, and you'll get ill within a couple of days. Like I said, no thanks. Okay, So we come to Edward Jenner. He was a doctor in Gloucestershire. That's all he was, just a general, what we call a GP today. Okay, and he set up practice in Gloucestershire after studying in London, I think. And one of the things he did was to offer inoculation, like all doctors, for a fee, a couple of shillings, a guinea, whatever you could afford. You could pay for this to be done. There was, of course, no national health then. We estimate that around about 7.6% of all the people that died in the UK around about that time, their deaths were caused by smallpox. Okay, it's hard to judge because census records weren't being taken that thoroughly as they are today. Okay, but around about 7.6% was the death rate. Okay. What he found, though, when he set up his practice is that a lot of the people, they were country people, of course, refused to have inoculation. I don't need that, doctor, because locally people knew that people like dairymaids or people who work with cows tended to pick up this infection called cowpox. You know, the cows had spots all over their udders, that kind of stuff. Milking was done by hand then by dairymaids and other farm workers, and they would catch this on their hands. And what they noticed is that if you had cowpox on your hands and your wrists and arms, well, you never got smallpox. All right, and everyone kind of knew that, but nobody really knew why. And he spotted this, and then he thought about it for about 23 years apparently, and did nothing about it. Okay, until one day he decides to experiment. Okay, and what he decides to do is to see whether he can give patients who weren't country people involved with milking cows a better way of being inoculated, protected from smallpox. Okay, so what he decided to do was perhaps take some smallpox matter, the pus and the scabs, from a dairymaid, give it to someone else and see what happens. Okay, and that's what he did. Okay, there is the famous Sarah Nelms in these paintings. So that's what he did exactly. He got a dairymaid called Sarah Nelms, took some of the pus and scabs off her arms and her wrists and hands. Then he looked at the window and saw his gardener's son, James Phipps, who was 8 years old, and decided, right, he'll do. Took him indoors, scratched his arm, put some of this pus and scabs on him, and just let him get ill. Okay, I mean, we'd be calling the NSPCC these days. That's just outrageous. So James Phipps got ill. Luckily, didn't die, survived. And then 6 weeks later, Jenner did the same thing to him again. Scratched his arm, but this time put the real nasty stuff in. You know, really treated him badly this time, and put a smallpox into him. Cannot emphasize just how dangerous and risky this is by modern standards. But James Phipps did not get ill. Okay, and he tried it with other patients, and none of them got ill too. Bingo! He seems to have found a safer way of protecting human beings from smallpox, this big killer. Okay, infect them with cowpox, the body develops immunity, they are now protected, they are not able to catch smallpox. Okay, and he called this vaccination. Vacca was the Latin word for cow. This is amazing. This is a breakthrough, and it's as incredible as like your local doctor claiming to have found the cure for cancer. It's just unheard of. Okay, so he wrote up his findings, sent it off to the Royal Society. If you remember going back to the Renaissance work, they were this group of men who were dedicated to improving our understanding of medicine and science. They refused to publish his work, and I'll go into details why in just a moment. So he decided to put his money where his mouth is, and in 1798 published his findings in possibly the longest entitled report ever, Inquiry into the Cause and Effects. You can read the rest of it yourself. And published it. Okay, well, it was a groundbreaking work. When it was picked up and read by people around the world, it's changed the way that smallpox was treated. Okay. And he did it for free. He didn't ask for any money or anything like this. He just said, you know, here it is. This is what I found. Give it a go. It works. I know it works. I've proved it works. Here we go. Okay. Incredible. Incredible. Let's have a look at the global impact. The President of the United States spoke in favor of it. Now, even then, the President was, of course, the most powerful man in North America. That's going to have weight with other doctors and make them do it too. Okay. At the time, the American First Nation, or Indians as sometimes they get referred to, they were suffering terribly from smallpox. It had actually been used as a form of germ warfare against them by settlers. As they moved west across the plains, they would give blankets that were taken from smallpox victims, deliberately infecting the Indian population, who would of course die out in their thousands. Okay, suddenly some doctors stepped in, because not everyone was horrible, and vaccinated them, and they never got it. And they inquired, where's this come from? There's a story of Jenner receiving a belt from an Indian tribe in gratitude for saving the tribe's life and their nation's life. Okay, 1805, the most evil man in Europe at the time, Napoleon Bonaparte, had the entire French army vaccinated. Again, you can't imagine what a risk that would have been, because if it hadn't worked, then the entire French army could have been killed. They weren't. They were protected against disease and able to, go and invade the rest of Europe. Okay. Inoculation, the actual old process of using smallpox, that itself was banned by the government in this country in 1840. 1852, smallpox vaccination became compulsory in Britain. And if you fast forward to 1980, the World Health Organization, run by the United Nations, declared that for the first time ever, a disease had been completely eradicated. Smallpox was gone. Okay, and we've got records of it, going back to the Egyptian times, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, but now it's gone totally. Okay, I mentioned earlier about people opposing his process and his findings. There were a few reasons. Okay, most people just don't like anything new. People don't like social media or internet and stuff like that. Some people are just wary of new things. Okay. Secondly, most important of all, he was a country doctor. Who is he? He wasn't professor of virology or anything at all. He was just a normal country GP, fixing broken bones and coughs and colds, that kind of stuff. And he'd found the cure for this global disease. A lot of people must have thought, yeah, right, okay. Obviously, he couldn't explain why it worked. No one could explain why inoculation worked, but he couldn't explain how vaccination worked. Immunology, the study of immunity and white blood cells, that was still decades, if not a century or so, in the future. Many doctors were quite selfish. They were making money. It was a nice little earner selling inoculation to patients. Now they didn't need it. Everybody knew how to do smallpox vaccinations. It was cheap and effective. And so, a lot of doctors would have put it down and said, "Oh no, it's too risky. Let's stick with the old thing." And there was still a small risk of infection happening. People were using, knives or needles that were dirty. We're still, about another 50, 60 years away, 61 years probably, from the discovery of bacteria and the importance of cleaning surgical instruments or medical things. Okay, so a lot of people just opposed his process. So why was he important? Again, you need to have this really straight, okay? Because you've got to say why he was important, and say he was important because he developed the first vaccination. And it was a safer way of preventing people catching smallpox. Okay, that's why he was so important. The very first vaccination that was safe. Okay. So let's look at public health and the improvements that were made to it during the 19th century. If you look at these pictures, I'll ask you quickly which ones you think are the odd one out. And you've got some tobacco there, you've got some drinking water, you've got a front door where somebody would live, and you've got the structure of society. You've got the working class, middle class, and the upper classes. Now, very quickly, the odd one out is going to be tobacco. We think of it as a great evil today and something that would kill you. Thing is, though, the other three were probably more likely to kill you in the 19th century than tobacco, because you probably die of something related to one of those, or if not all of them, before you got old enough to develop cancer. Okay. Yeah, so the tobacco is the odd one out. Okay. And there's your answer too. Yeah, you die. And it's not surprising if you look at this very famous picture cartoon that was published in Punch magazine in the 1840s, you can see what's wrong. There's a pile of dung in the street, people playing with it. That's nice. The scene is overcrowded. The housing at the back is very poor, very badly built. It looks like it's about to collapse. That's why you've got a big trunk of wood stopping the buildings collapsing into each other. If you look at the windows, they're full of people. There's a coffin being taken out. Death is just an everyday thing. Okay. And the streets are, filthy. There's no one clearing the streets. There's no sewers. By the look of it, there's no drainage, nothing like that. Okay, so people knew there was a problem. Okay, if you look at these very famous engravings as well, you can see the state of London. People are in rags. They're poor. The city streets are teeming with life. Can't imagine what the horse dung would have smelt like on that street. And you can see St. Paul's in the distance. And a steam train going over the bridge. Smoky, dirty, overcrowded. No drains, no clean water. People are generally poor. Okay. And this had been studied. Okay. People were starting to study it scientifically now, actually. Booth had put together this map late in the 19th century, like a poverty map, really, showing where the different classes of people lived according to their wealth. And if you look at the red ones on there, he identified from the income and the value of the property that they were middle class, well-to-do, he calls them on here. Okay, but if you look at the ones that are black and dark blue, they are criminal, the lowest of society, and that's where the disease and lifespans would have been shortest. So point is, people knew there was a problem, and people had been able to identify where the problems were. Okay. But nobody more was important in that identification than Edwin Chadwick, who wasn't a scientist at all, wasn't a doctor or chemist or anything like that. Okay, but he was very, very important. Let's have a look at what he did. Just actually ram home the cause of the problem. If you look at the graphs here, you can see, I'll put a description here, that in source A, the population rockets in the middle of the 19th century. It's all to do with increased use of technology and more food being available. Death rates in some way decline, so obviously more and more people live longer. Okay, you can see that cities are growing as well. People are moving from the countryside into the towns. Or even if there's not a town, moving there because there's a coal mine or steel works or factory. Yep, that provides them with the most horrible, dangerous, dirty jobs in the world, but it's regular jobs all year round. Okay, which wasn't the case in the countryside because you just looked to survive the winter. But you can see there's a cost because of all of that. 1831, 32, due to cholera, an epidemic that was spread, we eventually found out, by water, dirty water. There was 26,000 deaths, up to 53,000 in the late 1840s. And in the 1850s, another massive outbreak where 20,000 were killed. Okay, so you could see over the 20 years when industrialization is really booming, there is a price to pay: cholera and increased death rates. Okay, and I think I've mentioned that already. Yeah, industrialization. There was no public health measures taken by councils or anything like that. Nobody really knew what caused disease. And cholera was a particularly nasty disease. I put a description here. You'd have diarrhea and vomiting. You'd lose about 500 milliliters of fluid an hour, which is just water pouring out of you. Okay, and of course, if you didn't replace that, you would die. I mean, one of the remedies at the time is all sorts of nasty chemicals and spices, and I think even morphine or something like that, plus a cup of water. I mean, that's just going to increase your chances of dying. Okay. And it's quite possible that public health at the time and living conditions at the time had never been so bad in all of British history. It had never been this terrible. Okay, what should we do? Okay, I mean, people did know about it. I mean, here's a cartoon from the 1829. People suspect water. They can't see it. Yeah, they can't identify it. They haven't proven a link between what we now know is bacteria living in the water, but they knew, judging by cartoons like this, that water was pretty nasty. I mean, the cartoonist has drawn things in the water as like monsters that get into you. Okay. Yep. So I said, why didn't the government and the local council authority step in and start cleaning the streets? Didn't think it was their business. As far as they were concerned, the government dealt with wars and taxes, keeping law and order, cleaning the streets and public health, not our problem. Okay, that's something known as a laissez-faire concept, an idea, approach to things, and that dominates not just public health, but the way that many people saw the world then. prices and the market, buying and selling, just leave it and it will work itself out. Okay, we don't need to step in and tell people how to live their lives. Okay, so you ended up overall with these kind of problems. Industrialization attracted people, the housing was just thrown up cheaply and quickly by developers to try and start renting them out. The housing was then overcrowded. You ended up with 4 or 5 families living in one house, one family per room. There was no sewers to take away human waste, no water to bring clean water pipes, or there was no clean water supply at all. So the water was dirty, and the government had no interest in changing this. So outbreaks of cholera were just common, and you could die very quickly by cholera. By the way, you could be fit as a fiddle in the morning, suddenly feel a bit unwell, and you could be dead by tea time. Okay. So while you were poor and you were ill, you would normally claim money from the Poor Law Commission. Okay. Now that was, today we'd probably think of that as universal credit, national health and sickness benefit, that kind of thing. So if you were unable to work, you'd claim from them, appear at their door, get a few shillings to last you the week, and they'd record all this, and fingers crossed you'd be alive to come back and claim some more money. Okay, but the cost of this was going up and up and up. Right, so the Poor Law Commission decided that somehow these working class chappies were ripping them off, and what they needed to do was find out what's going on. Okay, so who they're going to call? Edwin Chadwick. They sent him out into the country and said, find out what's going on. We want to find out if we're being ripped off and how we're being ripped off, because we must be getting ripped off. So he was sent out to find ways of saving money, cutting down the cost of providing for people according to the Poor Law. Okay, and that's what he did. And he had some experience of analysing conditions and suggesting reform on a small level just in Whitechapel, but now he's going to do a UK-wide study. Okay, he did publish his work. 1842, his book comes out, The Sanitary Report. There's a copy of it in my room. You can find it as a PDF file on the internet very quickly. Okay, and he's gone down in history. I think it's probably where he lived, as a public health reformer, because he certainly was. He was probably shocked by what he discovered. Okay. This is probably the most famous page in his book, which has been shortened the title down to The Sanitary Report. What he found is that if you were a labourer, if you were a richer person, okay, you remember the gentry, a doctor, a lawyer, a solicitor, that kind of thing, and you lived in an urban area, your life expectancy would be a grand 35. Wow, okay, so there must be something going on that's very bad in an industrial area, okay. If you were a middle class person, your life expectancy was even lower. And most shockingly, he found in the docks of Liverpool that the average age of death for a man or boy was about 15, which is just horrendous. Again, government no interest in changing that or dealing with that. Okay, 15 years of age is probably the most famous statistic from public health in the 19th century. What you also found in the Sanitary Report is if you lived in the countryside, clean air, fresh food, not living in streets up to your ankles in public health waste, okay, then you lived a lot longer. Okay, so urban areas, life expectancy very short. The poorer you were meant that you had less healthcare, bad food, and appalling living conditions. You died young, 15. Okay. And overall, what he found is that poverty was caused by ill health. People were ill, okay, and the ill health was caused by their living conditions: dirty streets, badly built, damp buildings. Okay, that's what caused it. Okay, so what do we got to do? Well, we got to get rid of all these dirty, nasty living conditions. What he recommended, that the best way of reducing the poor relief bill, the amount of money spent on it, was to spend money improving people's living conditions. Better living conditions would mean you'd have better health, they'd have less need, they wouldn't get ill, they'd have less need to claim poor relief. Okay, and like I said, he put all that together in The Sanitary Conditions of the Labouring Population of Great Britain in 1842. Copy in my room. This the full title. And there we are. There's his full recommendations. You can see he's made a mistake with the first one. Okay, he says that disease is caused by atmospheric impurities. Well, it's 1842, 1861 is when we discover bacteria and germs. Okay, so as far as he's concerned, it's something in the air. Okay, we know it's called germs now. And he said that drainage needs to be improved. We've got to have, sewers built to take away human waste. We've got to clear rubbish from the streets regularly. Just can't let it build up, okay? And we've got to provide clean water to people to drink. Water that's not just taken from the river or a stream, but clean water, okay? So they wouldn't become infected. And that in every district, you should have a medical officer should be responsible for monitoring the health, the death rates, the birth rates of people and be alert to outbreaks of disease, okay? A medical officer. So why was he important? He was very important because he made this link between poverty, disease, and ill health. He proved it with statistics by interviewing people and writing up his findings, okay? And it's his recommendations that went on to become the basis of the Public Health Act, albeit 6 years later in 1848. Let's have a look at the Public Health Act of 1848, which actually wasn't an incredible act. It didn't do a great deal, but it was importantly a start. Let's have a look at what it actually entailed. Okay, well, it was a law. This law that was passed by Parliament, the House of Commons, set up this thing called the Central Board of Health. I mean, there was nothing like the NHS today, but this Central Board of Health, based in London, was taking on responsibility for public health. Okay, it had no money and it didn't really have the powers to enforce its ideas and recommendations. Okay, there were some corporations, councils around the country, like the one in Sunderland, that had taken responsibility for taking over the removal of rubbish and building sewers and drains, giving them clean water, that kind of thing. But it couldn't make other councils do those things that Sunderland had done. Okay, and in fact, a lot of councils didn't like the idea of London telling them what to do. They saw it as interference, and they didn't like that. Okay, what the Act did do, though, what importantly, was make loans of money available. So if any council did want to adopt these public health measures, these recommendations of cleaning up the streets and providing clean water and building sewers and drainage, they could pay for that with money they borrowed from the government, and then pay it back with money that they would raise then by increasing their local rates. Some would probably call poll tax or community charge these days. Okay, and they could set up medical officers in each of the boroughs to keep an eye on public health. Okay, if you had a death rate that was really bad, and in particular if it was 23 people dying out of 1,000, then it became compulsory. You had to have these measures put in place. Okay, but the big limitation of the Act itself was that it wasn't compulsory. It provided a framework, it provided money, but most councils didn't take up the offer. Only a third of councils in the UK got involved and borrowed money to improve public health in their towns and cities. So why was it important, though? It was important because it's a turning away from this laissez-faire attitude of just letting it work itself out. It's the first time the government actually took responsibility for public health and put something in place in a limited way, not a massive way. And you can see, 100 years later, the world changes because we set up the NHS in this country. Okay, have a look at these rather scary places in South Wales, up on the mountainside there above Tredegar. Could be any town really, out in the countryside, or a city, town, something like that. Okay, and you've got cemetery there dug just for cholera victims, people that had died of cholera. Okay, and what you notice, these are miles away from the town. They're miles away from anybody else at all. There's special places where they're burying these bodies because corpses were just so infectious. Okay, even when they were dead and in the ground, people were scared that they would still somehow infect them. Okay, what does tell us? People were terrified. They did not know what caused cholera. They were just so scared of catching it, and even the bodies, that they buried them far away. Okay, step in this fella, Dr. John Snow. Okay, he was very important in finding out what really caused cholera. Okay, at the time, people believed that it was caused by various things: God, the planets, that kind of stuff, or even miasma. This belief had been around for thousands of years. This belief that there was this invisible cloud of foul-smelling vapor, coming from volcanic eruptions thousands of miles away. They believe that was what had caused things like cholera and other diseases to kill you. Okay. And many people, still continue to believe that even up after 1861, when Louis Pasteur proved that it was germs, bacteria, that actually caused disease, not this smelling stuff. Okay. Who was he? He was just a doctor, and we see him really as the founding father of this thing called epidemiology. That's the study of patterns and the events, the causes, the impact of disease on the public. Okay, and his work, as you probably remember, was all about cholera. Okay, and the work that he did in 1854. And he wasn't a brilliant scientist or anything like that. He was a brilliant doctor, I suppose. He'd started his education at a very low level, moved to London to study medicine, became a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, and was eminent in his field at the time in the 1850s. Okay, like I said, at the time everybody believed that cholera was caused by miasma, stuff in the air. Well, he didn't really accept that, because it didn't make sense to him. He had this idea that somehow something was getting into people's bodies through the body and through the mouth, and that was making them ill. And he published these theories in 1849. And he had the opportunity in the summer of 1854 to put this to the test, because there was a terrible outbreak of cholera in Soho in London. I mean, the outbreak itself killed about 20,000 people across probably the country. Yeah. But he zoned in and went to Soho to find out what was causing this. Okay, it was a case study in. These are the kind of things that people were doing, though, at the time to try and get rid of the smelly bad air. They'd burn barrels of tar, bowls of vinegar everywhere. They'd smoke cigars, cigarettes, tobacco to try and drive away the smell of this disease. Okay. The kind of things that they were still doing in the 14th century when the Black Death was around, wearing Lucky Charms and taking nasty potions and pills that people would advertise that had more chance of killing you than protecting you. Okay, people were cleaning their houses. That's a good idea. Okay, and spraying this stuff called chloride of lime. This was a very early form of disinfectant. Okay, it certainly cover up the smell, make your eyes water, if not sting. Like I said, it was an early form of disinfectant. Okay, and burning the clothes, the bedding of victims, that's a good idea, because it destroys the bacteria in them as well. But it just shows they're doing everything and hoping something works. Okay, you can see here's a picture of the barrels of tar actually being burned in the streets at an earlier outbreak. Actually, the place must have smelt of just like tar you smell in the summer sometimes when you're having creosote, that kind of smell, painted onto wooden fences. Everywhere must have smelt like that. Okay, and the idea is you absolutely block out the smell of dirt and filth and sewers, I suppose. So if you can't smell it, you don't catch it. Well, it's not that simple, is it, as we know. By the way, he was also a pioneer in the use of anesthetics. Okay, that had been, we'll come to that later. 1847, James Simpson started to use chloroform. Okay, and in 1853, he was the doctor that was helping Queen Victoria, the monarch, give birth to her child, and she used chloroform during the painful birth, and her daughter was fine. Okay, why not then? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so he'd used that actually twice. Yeah, 1853 and 1857. Okay, so I mean, if the Queen uses chloroform, then it must be fine. But we'll come to that later. Okay, this is a source where he analyzes, where he writes up in his findings what he discovered when he went into Soho. Okay, he describes the most terrible outbreak of cholera that ever occurred. He identifies that I'm not going to read the whole thing, I'm just going to pick out the main bits. He identifies that it's worst around Broad Street and in the streets adjoining it. Okay, and that from his studies, speaking to people and analysing the records, there's about 500 people dying in just 10 days. Okay, and it's just incredible. Okay. Um, what he did find as well is that most of the deaths, on all of the deaths really, had occurred not far away from this famous water pump. People would go up to the water pump, use the handle, pump, 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 and get water out of it, take it away, drink it, washing it, that kind of stuff. Okay, and the further away you went from this pump, the less death there was. Okay. He did interview a Mr. Huggins, who ran a brewery there, okay? And what he found is that there was dozens of workmen working there. None of them were dying. What was going on? Well, there was two things in their favour. They were getting free beer. They had an allowance every day, so they were drinking beer rather than water, okay? And they also had their own well in the brewery as well. So not the water pump, not the well, or stream, whatever it was, that was supplying the pump in Broad Street. Okay, so they were fine. Wonder what could be the link there. Wonder what was saving them. Beer and water that's not from Broad Street. Okay, and there was also a case of somebody that lived a mile or so away, who used to live in Broad Street and liked the water. It was sweeter to them. So every day she'd pay a boy to go down to the pump in Broad Street, bring her back a couple of bottles of this lovely water, and she died. Okay, so it just proved to him that it's the water in the pump in Broad Street that was killing him. Not the air, nothing like that, but water. And he did this map where he plots the deaths as a kind of bar graph all over a map, and the bigger the bar chart, the more deaths there are in the area or at that address. And he would literally knock on doors and say, I hear that you've had a loss. I'm very sorry for your loss. May I come and speak to you? And he'd interview them and write down his notes, and bingo, more often than not, he'd find out that Broad Street, the pump there, was where they got their water. Okay. Here's a close-up of it. You can see where the pump is, right in the middle of the picture on the left-hand side. And any house that's near it, there's lots and lots of people dying. Each line is a death in that household, tragically. Okay. And there's a photo of, it's probably a replica of the pump in Broad Street with its handle removed. Okay. Because the street's been renamed and remodeled and all that kind of stuff. But it's commemorated, I suppose, with this replica there today. And that kind of sums up again what I was just saying. Yeah, the street's now called Broadwick Street. He identified it was the pump there that was killing people, and he proved really that water was carrying cholera, not miasma, nothing else. All right. And now in September 1854, he demanded the authorities remove the pump. They did, and what you see is the cases of cholera start to drop. Now, critics would argue it was dying out anyway, but certainly he made sure that nobody could get the water out of that pump anymore. Okay. And here you can see Max here, who went to Soho in December 2023, sent me this lovely picture. What a legend. The pub itself behind him is called the John Snow 2. That's a great honour for somebody in London. So why was he important? He was important because he proved that cholera was in the water. You got it by drinking dirty water. Not miasma, nothing else. Okay. Let's have a look at what Florence Nightingale did to improve nursing as a profession and to improve care in hospital for people in the 19th century. Before we get to her, though, let's make it clear that women in medicine was not an accepted thing. If you wanted to be a doctor in the 19th century, in this country you had to be a member of the colleges of physicians, surgeons, of apothecaries, according to law, the Medical Registration Act. Women, by law, were not allowed to join. So you could do all the studies, qualify, be brilliant, but you can't join that, so you can't legally be a doctor. Okay. Apart from somebody like Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who I'm not going to do this PowerPoint without mentioning her, she was the first British woman doctor, and she had to go to France and learn how to speak French and have all her lectures in French. She had studied in Edinburgh and been treated appallingly by the students there, who just, we call it bullying today, misogynistic bullying. So she went to France and learnt to speak French, did all her university studies in French too, came top of the class, first in the exams, and was therefore qualified to teach medicine, okay, or practice medicine. Back to Florence Nightingale, though. At the time, women were, they were accepted, but only as nurses. Women were seen as natural nurses because of their stereotypical, more caring nature, okay, and it was, tended to be Not something that a member of the middle class would do, because ladies from the middle classes and above were expected to find themselves a good man, a good husband, a rich husband, even better, to take care of them. Okay, not something that a wealthy woman would do at all. Okay. But Florence Nightingale was from the upper classes. She'd been groomed since birth, I suppose, to find herself a rich man and get married, have children, that kind of thing. Okay, but she had this very genuine spiritual belief that God Himself was expecting her to become a nurse. She had what people would call a calling to do this, right? A genuine spiritual religious calling to be a nurse. Opportunity came with the Crimean War, broke out in 1853. The Ottoman Empire was slowly declining. It was a sick man of Europe, and the Russians wanted all that land. Okay, today it would be parts of modern-day Turkey and the Middle East. Okay, and the Balkans, which are just outside Russia, which Russia wants to make sure is under their control and nobody else's, so they don't get invaded. Okay, so it was a war between Russia, Britain, and France, fighting over this land as the Ottoman Empire declined. Okay. So Britain and France were allies, and they sent soldiers out to what we'd call modern-day Ukraine, to a place called the Crimea, which at present is still occupied by the Russians, and that's where they landed and started their campaign against the Russians to drive them back. Okay. Soldiers leaving in 1854. Just put that in so you can see what they looked like when they went. Okay. And she was determined to do her bit. This was her chance. Okay, so she put together a team of nurses. She visited hospitals to look at how they did things and to see what things were good, what didn't work, and was just shocked by the level of dirt and disease in hospitals, and she was determined to do something better. And she persuaded the government to let her send her and her team of nurses out to the Crimea, modern-day Ukraine, to set up army hospitals, because at the time you were just as likely to die from diseases like cholera and diphtheria, typhoid, all those kind of stuff, in a military hospital than you were from a sword wound or a bullet wound. Okay, if you went in with a scratch, you'd probably catch some sort of nasty infection because the hospitals were so filthy, and then die from that. Okay, so she arrived in the Crimea at a place called the Selimi Barracks, Scutari. Okay, she had 34 nurses with her, and what she found was a mess, a disgrace. The officials were, did what they could, but due to shortages of money and ignorance, lack of understanding of bacteria, because it was still a few years away from 1861, she found that hygiene, keeping things clean, was neglected. Sheets weren't changed, dressings weren't changed. There was, rats were running all over the place. There was nowhere to really cook proper food for soldiers to, put some calories in them and help them keep their immunity up. Okay, and catching diseases and infections was just commonplace. Okay. And of course, she discovered that the hospital that was there at Scutari was had a very large cesspool. Human waste was gathering there, which of course was coming out of the ground, in the air, on people's feet, into the hospital. People would catch it. Patients' waste wasn't being cleaned up at all. So bad as well that you had cockroaches and insects and rats everywhere too. Okay, and soap was barely anywhere. She decided things need to change. That's what Scutari Hospital apparently looked like, in probably a very cleaned up version that appeared in the press at the time. There's very little beds. There are patients lying all over the place. The floor is filthy. The walls are dirty. It's dark. The windows are closed, so you can't get any fresh air in there. It's just a hellhole. Okay, breeding ground for infection. Not where you'd want to be if you had an open wound. So she set to work, rolled up her sleeves, and her and her nurses scrubbed that hospital from top to bottom with soap and hot water. Scrubbed the walls, cleaned it up, made sure the patients were fed, changed the sheets, got the bandages and had dressings changed to reduce the chance of infection. And she was famous in the newspapers at the time for walking the wards at night with her lamp, just checking on patients and having a few words with them, seeing if they're okay, calling a nurse to help her deal with a patient who was suffering, those kind of things. Okay, she became known as the lady with the lamp. And you can see what someone like Scutari looked like after it was cleaned up as well. Very clean floors, proper beds, windows are open, letting in fresh air to blow away bacteria, reduce the chance of bacteria growing. You've got a stove there to keep it warm and to cook food on. It's a much more orderly, cleaner environment, so less chance of bacteria growing and spreading and infecting and killing soldiers. There's a nice story connecting Swindon with Florence Nightingale as well. The most eminent engineer of his time was Isambard Kingdom-Brunel, of course built the GWR works. She asked him if he could put his skills together to build her a prefabricated hospital. If you've got a metal shed, this is the kind of thing they were talking about. Panels and bits of metal that could be put together like a huge Lego set, I suppose, or Meccano set, if you've ever heard of that, shipped out to the Crimea and then put together, because it'd be clean and it would be watertight and it wouldn't leak, okay? And it could be erected, put up anywhere they could, okay? And here's the plans for it, okay? It became known as the Renkioi Hospital, and Dr. Parks that ran it found that once it was up and running, and it was built and up and running and casualties were coming in, the death rate was a tenth of what it was before when the original hospital at Scutari was taking casualties, okay? And the overall effect was that she reduced the death rate in the Crimean War in hospitals from 42% down to just 2%, which is incredible, even by modern standards, to not lose people due to infection due to lack of hygiene and bacterial wounds. That's just incredible, down from 42% to 2%. Why else was she important? Well, not just that particular case study, cleaning up hospitals in Crimea, but she went on to establish nursing as a profession, something which women had to be good at doing, and there were standards that had to be kept, clean overalls, clean hands, that kind of stuff, okay? And be dedicated to the care of patients too. And she changed the focus really of the way that people thought about hygiene in hospitals. From now on, people had a sense that you've got to have a hospital that's clean, okay? If they're clean, there's less chance of bacteria infecting wounds, killing patients. And she set up the Nightingale School of Nursing. To go back to the point about nursing at St Thomas's Hospital, that's where nurses were trained, did a course, and they were emerging from the hospital as trained nurses with an understanding about how they should do things, how clean they should be, how clean the hospital ward should be as well, okay? And in the workhouses as well, these horrible places that existed then, there was training put on for midwives, people that delivered babies as well, okay? All these things add up to improving your chances of survival if you go into a hospital. So overall then, why was she important? She's important because she proved that clean hospitals reduce the death rate, and she made nursing a much more professional occupation, made nursing better in hospitals too, okay? But even though Florence Nightingale was super important, we can't move on without mentioning Mary Seacole. Mary Jane Grant, Mary Seacole as she was known, was a Jamaican nurse, and she learned her skills in nursing from her mother, who had a boarding house in Jamaica looking after invalid soldiers. Okay, when the Crimean War started, she did the same as Florence Nightingale. She went out there and provided her services as well. What she set up was something known as the British Hotel. So it served as a place where soldiers could have a rest and sleep and be treated for a fee, okay? But she also was incredibly brave, and she would ride out onto the battlefield on horse apparently and perform operations, bandage wounds, save lives, okay? To the point where she was known as Mother Seacole by the soldiers because of how much she did for them. Okay, so it's not just Florence Nightingale, it's also other women like Mary Seacole and Elizabeth Garrett Anderson that improved the stature really of women in medical care, in the medical profession. On to the work of Joseph Bazalgette. Why was he so important? Let's have a look. Well, his chance to make his mark came with something that became known as the Great Stink of 1858. The population of London, as you've already seen, has been increasing in cities and towns around the country. And in London in particular, you've got up to 2.5 million people in London living with very little public health at all. The public health system, what there was, probably hadn't been changed since Elizabethan times, okay? And the latest fad was something called a water closet, indoor flushing toilets or outdoor flushing toilets, which were suddenly increasing the amount of human waste which was making their way into the sewers. Sewers which had been designed firstly hundreds of years ago for rainwater and some sewage to go into them. Okay, if you ever see the letters WC, that's what it means, water closet. Okay, toilets. Because previously it had all gone into cesspits, that kind of thing. Right, so what was the effect? Well, you now had in the 1850s this massive increase of raw sewage going into the Thames. Okay? And this water was then taken out by water companies who provided you with water, from a standpipe, from a water pump that you'd pay to have access to, and be drunk by the customers, who would then, of course, die of cholera. Okay. Now in 1854, as we saw, John Snow proved that it was dirty water, nothing else, that gave you cholera. What are we going to do? Okay, well, the time came in 1858 with the Great Stink. Okay, there was an outbreak of cholera earlier that decade, where over 10,000 people had been killed. That's the time that John Snow proved there was a link with the water. But again, you had this problem where people didn't, or local councils didn't have the money to pay for this, or were unwilling to invest in building sewers. Okay, the Metropolitan Commissions of Sewers, Commission of Sewers, they had this responsibility, but they didn't have the legal right to start charging for the building of sewers, which is going to be something that would cost millions. It's being done today across London now, and it's costing millions and millions to do. And people knew. Here's a letter from July 1858, which is pointing out the disgusting state of the city. And a quotation from it says, "What we need is a scheme likely to remove a nuisance and preserve their lives. The nuisance being filth, disease, or filth, human waste, that kind of stuff, and to allow people to survive." Okay. Here's a cartoon from that year as well, where you've got Britannia, this mythical figure that represents Britain, being approached by diseases on their knees, emanating from the Thames. Okay, and Father Thames is saying, look at all these diseases that are coming out of this water. What are you going to do? And Britannia is recoiling back, going, "Ooh, get away." Okay, doing nothing. So the Great Stink, as it became known as, in the summer of 1858, happened because it was extremely hot, and the water levels dropped because there was a drought and it was just super hot. And so what you had was tons and tons of human waste just landing on the banks of the Thames and not being taken away by the tide. It was very low tide, very little water. There was one observation where somebody went down onto the banks and watched the dead body of a dog. It was a dog, wasn't it? In the water, being taken down a few hundred yards down the Thames when the tide went out. When the tide came in, brought the body of the dog practically to the same spot. So if you multiply that effect across the whole of the tons and tons of sewage that was landing on the banks every day, nothing was being taken out. It was just gathering and gathering. Okay, and it got so bad that the House of Commons, which of course the Palace of Westminster is built on the banks of the River Thames, had to close because the smell was just so bad. It was making members of Parliament choke and vomit and stop meetings. Famously, a future Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, was in a meeting and just had to leave the room and throw up. They were spraying the curtains all over the Palace of Westminster with this stuff called chloride of lime, which again was a very strong, powerful smelling kind of disinfectant, but it wasn't enough. So things got changed because the rich and powerful men of this country could not do their business. They could not do the business of the empire that had conquered India, as the quote says here, and it was costing money. Finally, when it hit the politicians, they wanted to do something. Okay. An article from the Illustrated London News points out we can conquer India, but we cannot clean the River Thames. How pathetic is that? We need to do something. And Parliament decided that now was the time to do something. Up until then, they hadn't really been bothered. But now, because it affected them, they were going to do something. And in just a record 18 days, they passed the law. That's unheard of. Normally it takes years, months and years to get a law through because it's got to go through a very slow, laborious process. But in just 18 days, this law was rushed through. Everybody voted in favour of it, and a law was passed that they were going to grant funds to build this huge sewer system around London, which an engineer called Joseph Bazalgette had put together already. He had plans waiting to go. Okay, so they were going to build sewers, build an embankment along the Thames to increase the flow of traffic around the Thames itself, and to get rid of the human waste and not have it go into the River Thames where people were living. But just 8 short years, this whole thing was finished. Okay. What happened was that in the ground underneath the Thames, or sorry, the banks of the Thames on the north and the south side, this network of sewers was built, low-level sewers that sewage pipes would go into from people's homes. It would then be taken into a main sewer and taken down either side of the banks of the Thames, not flowing into the river itself, and then flowing further down where it would be pumped out to sea. Okay, and it's incredible engineering feat, over 1,000 miles long when you put it all together. 3.5 million cubic yards of earth, 318 million bricks, all of them handmade and then put in place to build the sewers. Million cubic yards of cement. It's an incredible feat. And of course, there's no computers then. There's no to help with the design. There's no big excavators. There's no huge lorries. There's no cranes or anything like that. It's all done by pick and shovel and hand. Okay, thousands and thousands of workers. And this is what he produced. These beautiful underground sewers acting like little streets under the earth, underneath the pavement on the north and south banks of the Thames, carrying some lovely human waste, some lovely Victorian red bricks there. Okay, bricks that are designed to be very smooth, and the mortar used to lay the bricks and to line the sewers as well was a special kind that was mixed on site because it was very smooth and it would dry very quickly, but reduce the friction, so water would flow over it very quickly and not have anything sticking around. Okay, and these sewers were built to last. All right, this is a picture of some men with a lovely job of cleaning out some sewers in 1974, just a couple of years after I was born. They look the same. If you go back to the early pictures, they look exactly the same because they were built to cope with an even bigger population. It wasn't just to cope with the current population, but for a population 2 or 3 times bigger. And it wasn't until the late 20th century, early 21st century that it was recognized that the sewers were now not coping with the population of, something like 8 million people in London. Okay, so an incredible engineering feat built to last. Where did it all go? It went here, the Crossness pumping station, and you can visit it. What a great school trip this would be. A sewage cathedral downstream the River Thames. The idea is that there's the River Thames that used to carry all the human waste out to the sea, well, not very well, okay, carry it from West London, North London, South London, down it would go, okay, and out towards the estuary of the Thames into the North Sea. Bazalgette sewers did this job, okay. They would be built north and south, carry the sewage down, and then because it was at they would use a system of gravity. Okay, it would drop from West London to East London. It would use gravity to allow the flow of sewage, but by the time it got to the east end of London, it would be 50, 60 feet below ground. Well, how'd you get it up? He built this huge pumping station with these steam engines, so coal-fired steam engines, heat water, drive the steam pumps that would then pump up the sewage to the surface and pump it out into the Thames, away from everybody, out into the North Sea where it wouldn't harm anybody. Okay. Opened in 1865. Prince of Wales there is making a big speech opening it. The pumps itself, there was 4 of them, named after Victoria, Prince Consort Alexandra, and Albert, her children. And like I said, it pumped out the raw sewage and take it out to the sea. The whole place was abandoned in the 20th century, and a restoration project began in 1984, I think it was, and now it's open. And like I said, it's known as Sewage Cathedral because it's a brilliant example of Victorian engineering. So why was it good? Well, it just proved that if you spent money on improving public health, building sewers, it was a good idea. Cholera rates dropped. The Thames never became full of human waste again. He proved that technology can solve health problems, not science, not just science, but technology as well. And they were working for centuries afterwards. And he trained lots of other engineers too, and gave advice to other cities that were building their sewer system. And the same kind of sewer system was copied in Budapest, Port Louis, Mauritius, New York, places like that. Okay, so his work demonstrated investment in building sewers improved public health, and it carried on around the world as well. You can see there's a memorial here to recognize the work that he did. Okay, so overall then, again, why was Joseph Bazalgette important? He proved that a good sewer system works. It reduces death rates. It gets rid of cholera. Okay, and he proved that investing in public health meant that the Thames was clean. Less people died of cholera. Okay. On to the next one, and this is a big one. This is probably the biggest one in the 19th century. Why was Louis Pasteur so very, very important? Well, he discovered germs, as we've talked about already. Okay. At the time, people didn't really understand the cause of disease. They thought it was bad luck. It was the cat. They thought it was the alignment of planets, Mars and Jupiter in line with something. Thought it was God punishing you for swearing or living a sinful life. I mean, these are all the kind of things that were still or were used to explain diseases for centuries, even going back to the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century. Same thing. But here we are in the middle of the 19th century, people still thinking the same thing. Okay. They believed in miasma, okay, that it was smells in the air that caused it. Or they believed in something called spontaneous generation, that somehow decaying matter just made flies and maggots and that kind of stuff, okay? It's the other way around, actually. It's flies and maggots growing in decaying matter that then spread disease around, okay? So they had an inkling, they had some idea, but it was not quite right. It was off target. Who was he? He was a French chemist. All right, and in 1861 he published something called the germ theory, which he laid out his experiments and proved beyond doubt, even though people did, the existence of germs, bacteria, okay, in liquids and in the air. He was working on this thing called fermentation, which is the process of turning liquid and hops and yeast and that kind of stuff into beer. All right, and he was called in by the local brewery because their vats were somehow infected by the look of it, and the beer was going off. And he was determined actually to improve French beer because he hated the Germans. I'll come to that in just a minute. Okay. What he discovered when he analysed the liquids with his microscopes and his scientific methods was that there were these little things germinating, these little organisms that were growing from one sample to the next, getting bigger and bigger and spoiling the beer. Okay, and he called them germs because they were germinating, growing, just like a seed in the ground germinates and grows. These things are doing this in the liquid. Okay, so it was germs which were causing healthy cells to become destroyed. Not miasma, not God, not planets, nothing else, just germs. And he also proved as well you could kill these germs in a liquid by heating it up to 75 degrees centigrade, which is 25 degrees less than boiling point. But if you heated it up to 75, you would kill the germs. He made the French beer recover, and when it was the pasteurization process, as it was called, was used in the making of the beer lasted longer because it went out to the customer with less germs in it. We still do this today with milk. And if you go to your fridge, open it, pick out a bottle of milk, have a look at it, there should be something on it saying it's been pasteurized if it's cow's milk. How did he do this then? Well, how did he carry on with his studies? He also proved that germs were in the air. He did this flask experiment in and around Paris. He went out into the streets of Paris. Picture there are some dirty streets, packed with people, just like Victorian London, Victorian Paris, just the same, okay? And he had these sterile flasks which had been cleaned and washed in boiled water, no chance of any germs in them. And he kind of wafted them around by the sound of it, put the plug on them, took them back to the laboratory, did the same in an area in the countryside, fresh air, no less germs, clean air, wafted them around, put the plug on them, took them back, and you could see when he looked at the flask apparently that these things, germs, were growing in the flask from the streets that were done in the streets of Paris. Therefore, there must be bacteria in the air. Okay, now you can't scrub air, but at least it proves that germs are in the air. Not miasma, not planets, nothing like that. Okay. And he had microscopes. I mean, these are the kind of things he could see with things in the liquid and analysis. The scientific factor is at play here. His microscopes could magnify things up to 1,000 times more than the naked eye and allow you to see them. And it's only the development in technology in the 19th century that allowed him to do such things. Okay. And he found that he was ridiculed by people because of this, and so he repeated the experiments over and over and over, did them in a very scientific, methodical way, wrote up his theories, his process, until it was undeniably true that bacteria was in liquids and air. Now, it sounds strange to us because we've all been brought up since children to wash our hands to get rid of germs and to put a hand over our mouth when we cough and sneeze to stop germs getting out into the air. But 1861, he proved that these existed, all right, and that they were the cause of disease. French silk industry, he was able to identify bacteria that was killing their crop, okay? And I've mentioned this already, pasteurizing milk. We still do that today. Heating a liquid to kill the germs in it so that it doesn't go off and it stays fresh and it's safe to drink without putting bacteria into you, okay? You theorize then, so if they're causing things to go bad, like plants, silk and beer and liquids and milk and that kind of stuff, maybe it's the same thing that could happen to human beings. And he wrote in his book at the time, if wine and beer are changed by germs, then the same must happen sometimes in men and animals. We must be affected by these germs too. Okay. So why was he important? He was important because he proved that germs actually exist and that they are the cause of disease and infection in human beings. Okay. Right, the next one we're going to look at is a German scientist by the name of Robert Koch. Okay, he was somebody. It was around the same time as Louis Pasteur, and I wish they could have worked together. Okay, right. Who was he? Well, he built really on the work of Louis Pasteur, like a standing on the shoulder of a giant. Once Pasteur proved that germs existed, this opened up a whole new world. Opened the door into the world of bacteria. Okay. Robert Koch was able to, in 1876, identify that there were specific bacteria that cause specific diseases. So, for example, the first breakthrough came with identifying the bacteria that caused anthrax, which killed cattle and sheep, even humans as well. It was a deadly disease because if your entire field of cattle die, that's it. That's your living gone. Okay. How did he do it? Very, very meticulous experiments and research. He had this bacteria called anthrax, and he put it into these mice, and he had 20 generations of them go through, and he could identify at the end of it that the mice are still dying from this particular bacteria. There was another section that had nothing in them and they were fine. So it's this stuff that you can see in the microscope, this bacteria that was causing it. Okay, so not just bacteria, all of it, but a specific kind within that. Okay, how do you do it? Very, very methodical, painstaking chemical process. Okay, he had a whole team working with him as well that were able to share the whole workload too. They were able to identify that there were different types of bacteria, such as the ones that cause cholera and tuberculosis. How did they do it? Lots of them working together, classifying the different bacteria, and this particular thing called staining, where he would use a stain on slides of samples to see them clearer under a microscope. Now, you've probably done the same thing in science when you get onion cells or plant cells or cheek cells and you put them on a slide. You put this iodine stuff, I think, is it purple stuff, and then you can see it much clearer. It just shows up a lot better. Okay. And I said earlier, I wish they could have worked together, but they competed. Maybe that helped as well, the fact that they were competing against each other. Pasteur hated Germany. He hated them because his son had gone off with the French army when they were fighting against the Germans, or they were called Prussia, actually. The Franco-Prussian War of 1871, when Paris was occupied by the Germans. His son had died of disease itself, or a disease. I think it was diphtheria or typhoid, while away fighting the Germans. So he hated them because, as far as he was concerned, his son would never have gone away if it wasn't for them. Okay, so he didn't want anything to do with people like Koch because they were German. Okay? So they competed with each other to try and find vaccines for diseases the quickest. Okay. Pasteur looked into cholera that was affecting particularly chickens. There was a special kind of cholera that was affecting them and devastating the French farming industry because, you know, chicken meats and that kind of stuff, it was costing, by modern standards, would have cost millions. Okay, and he isolated, very luckily, the particular bacteria that caused this. I think he went on holiday, came back, and just like some story that you find in the 21st century, found that his samples had been left exposed to the sun. Okay, and he thought, well, these are no good to me, but he injected them into chickens and found what he was giving them really then was a weak version of chicken cholera. And of course, if you think back to Jenner, he was vaccinating them against it. The body recognized, I've got this version of cholera in me, or the chickens did, I suppose, and developed an immunity, the white blood cells. And so when they did come in contact with real full strength chicken cholera, they were fine. Okay. Yeah, completely by accident, he found this vaccine and saved the entire French chicken industry. Good for him. And it continues. You then, during the 19th century, find vaccines for all sorts of things are available. Smallpox, we knew about. Tuberculosis, TB, cholera, typhus, pneumonia, meningitis, the plague, diphtheria, dysentery. All these things now, scientists are able to identify the specific bacteria, develop a vaccine for them, give them to people, and protect them. Death rates plummet. So why was Robert Koch himself then important? Well, he's important because he was the first person to be able to identify different types of bacteria and then develop specific vaccines to protect us against them. Okay. Right, now let's have a look at how surgery, or how far surgery improved during the 19th century. Okay. I don't think any of us would like to have an operation performed like this. Going back to the beginning of the 19th century, think to yourself about what's wrong there. It looks horrible. Well, first of all, the patient's having to be held down because there's no anaesthetic at all, so he's going to feel the pain. He's having his leg amputated. There's a doctor that's, you know, got hold of that one leg, and he's going to quickly cut that leg off, saw through the bone, and then sew it up quickly before the patient bleeds to death. There's lots of people in that room just watching. They will have paid some money to buy a ticket to go into this and watch it like they were watching a show in a theatre. Hence, it is known as an operating theatre. Okay, none of the people there, the assistants, are wearing masks, so everything they're breathing out is going all over that open wound. None of them are wearing gowns or hairnets or gloves at all. So everything that they've got on their bodies are going to go into that wound as well. And the floor itself is pretty dirty and grubby. It's just a wooden floor that everybody would have walked on and carried in, you know, dung and everything on their shoes into that operating theatre. So and nobody would want to have that operation, okay, because you'd probably get infected and die. And there you are. There's a picture of an operating theatre at a museum. You can go in there and stand there like you're on the terraces, sit down like you're at the theatre, and see what's going on the operating table in the centre. Okay. Again, you can see some medical students here. Much later on, you can see there's some improvement here. The patient's got something over their mouth. That's interesting. And the doctors are wearing gowns, but they're still all just sat there, peering in. One in the front with his theatre glasses, getting a close-up with his binoculars of the operation. Okay. So what were the difficulties, the dangers of having an operation in the 19th century before some of the key improvements? Well, pain. Patients would feel every single stroke of the scalpel and the saw. The wound would probably get infected, and there was no way to stop patients losing blood and bleeding to death. Okay. And it was a problem. There's a famous example here, which you can read, of the Battle of Borodino. This is when Napoleon is retreating from Russia. There's a case famously described of surgeons operating quickly, having to amputate a leg in just 2.5 minutes so that the patient wouldn't die, but the doctor doing it so quick. He takes off some important parts, I should call them, of the patient themselves. Okay, then cuts the fingers of the assistant, who dies of fright apparently. Yeah, so a very, very risky process being operated on and having amputations done. Okay, how did they deal with the problem of pain beforehand? Because not everybody went into an operation and didn't have any anesthetic at all. There was a thing called nitrous oxide, which is still around today. Okay, it's illegal stuff now, called laughing gas is the other name for it. Okay, it would have some effect, but the patients would be rolling around and be numb to some extent, but they'd be awake, and they'd be able to feel some pain. And it's hard to perform intricate operations on somebody when they're still feeling some pain. There was something called ether as well, which may be up in the chemistry laboratories in school. That was used as an anesthetic as well, but it was a very caustic substance, very dangerous substance as well. It would make patients vomit and cough and splutter, and it was quite dangerous to have around because it was quite flammable too. If you had too much, then you could end up sleeping for days or overdosing with it. Okay, so still, when the patient's wriggling around and vomiting, it's hard to perform very difficult, intricate operations upon them. So this stuff kind of worked, but wasn't great. I wouldn't recommend it now. Okay, until this man came along, James Simpson. Okay, who was he? He was a Scottish man. He was professor of surgery, so he knew his stuff at Edinburgh University, and he specialized in surgery and the study of childbirth. Actually, how to deliver babies safely in a maternity ward. Okay. And the idea of pain, as when women are giving birth, had always interested him. How can I alleviate the pain and make the whole process of a woman giving birth safer? Okay, and he'd always experimented, and he started to experiment actually with different concoctions, different things. Okay, famously, 1847, he went home with a jar of this stuff that he had, and put it on the dining room table with his assistants, and they all kind of had a whiff of it to see if it would have any effect on them at all. Okay, and this stuff was called chloroform. Famously, the bottle itself, when it was opened, got knocked over. Him and his assistants passed out because this stuff was very strong. They inhaled it. They were knocked out. They were anaesthetized. One of them apparently banged his head, doesn't remember it happening at all, and was unharmed, didn't feel the pain when he banged his head. Okay, they come round when his wife walks in, like, what on earth is going on, and cleans up, and he realizes it's a eureka moment. We've just all been knocked out by chloroform. We didn't feel any pain, or one of us didn't, when they banged their head. Maybe this will work. So he went into the hospital that week and tried it out on 30 different patients, and they all had relatively successful operations because they weren't wriggling around. They were completely knocked out during the process as well. Okay, and they survived. Okay, what this meant is that you could now do operations at a safer, much more reasonable and sensible speed without rushing and harming the patient. Okay, you could do much more intricate operations that really doctors had been aware were reluctant to do previously. Okay, but yet again, just like with Jenner and anybody else that came up with a new process in the 19th century, some people objected to it. They claimed that pain was sent by God, and you should just take it. Even I think the chief of medical care for the army said, it's good to hear a man who's been injured in battle screaming with agony afterwards. It showed that he'd done his bit. Crazy stuff. Okay, all of this died out because chloroform was used by Queen Victoria when she gave birth, and as you probably heard earlier, this was administered to her by Dr. John Snow, who went on to investigate cholera. Okay, so that's it. If it's good enough for the Queen, it must be good enough for everybody else. So you start to see people accepting the use of chloroform for surgical operations. Not all of this is good news though, because what you do find for the 20 years after that is what's been termed the black period of surgery, because suddenly everybody's using chloroform to anaesthetize their patients. This means they can do more operations, and therefore more people die, not because of cholera, but because they become infected. More and more people are becoming infected by bacteria in the air. This is 1847. Not quite the chronological order I promised at the beginning, but more and more operations have been done. It increases the opportunities for patients to become infected because people or surgeons didn't wash their hands, they didn't wear masks, they coughed all over their patients, and even going from operation to operation with an apron, smeared with blood and bacteria from patient after patient was almost like a badge of honor for the wards. Look how busy I've been. This blood-soaked gown around you. Okay, so yeah, black period of surgery was due to more and more infections taking place just because more and more operations were taking place. Okay. So why was he important? James Simpson was important because he discovered this better way of performing operations, because he could anaesthetize patients, made it less painful for them. Okay, so that 20-year period, if you go from 1847 to 1867, is crucial, because in 1867 we get to a man called Joseph Lister. He also made a massive improvement in surgery too. Okay. At the time, when you got an infection, what you did develop was this thing called gangrene. This bacterial infection got into you, and it would start to, just kill the tissue, kill the live tissue in your body. So if you had a leg wound or a foot wound, it would become infected, go all sorts of nasty colours and smell, produce all this yucky pus, and the only way to save the rest of the body was to lop off, amputate the stuff that was diseased. Okay. There is a toe that's got gangrene, and that the rest of the skin looks pretty angry and red as well. So I suspect that person would probably lose their leg just below the knee to save the rest of the body, because it would go around the body, infect you with septicemia, and kill you. Okay. Yuck. And I mentioned this already. Doctors didn't know about germs at the time, or hadn't been readily accepted, or they didn't know how to kill it. Even if they did understand that there was germs in bacteria in water and the air, they didn't know how to get rid of it. And it was just a standard thing. You could see this famous headstone. It's about Rick Richards, who by gangrene lost first a toe, afterwards a leg, and lastly his life. In 1656. Okay, so it would spread around the body. Okay, it was quite common even in the 19th century for doctors to write that they'd done an operation and removed the tumor or amputated the leg, and it was a success, but the patient died. Okay, ironic, isn't it? And when you did have an operation in a hospital, even if it was relatively clean, a quarter of patients died from infection. Women that gave birth at home were more likely to survive than being in a hospital ward, because doctors didn't wash their hands, they didn't perform operations that we would consider to be bacteria free. Okay, so enter Joseph Lister. He is based in Scotland also, but at Glasgow University, and he looked at what Pasteur did and thought it was very interesting, this idea of germs being in water and air, and maybe infection is getting into my patients from the air as well. Maybe these microorganisms are getting into wounds and germinating. If only I could have some way of scrubbing the air and cleaning the air around my patients. Okay. And he had a breakthrough. He had a visitor to the hospital in 1867 who sort of walked around and went, "Phew, the smell in here, it's like sewers, And he'd also read about Durham in the north of England that had a massive flood, and the sewers had broken, and sewage was all over the streets and cobblestones, and they'd wash the streets with this stuff called carbolic acid, which is a pretty caustic acid which had killed everything in sight and cleaned the place up. He thought, maybe if I was able to spray the air around my patients with a diluted version, some water in it, like a 1 part of carbolic acid to 20 bits of water, maybe that'll be better. I'll spray it around patients and they won't develop gangrene. I'll give it a go. Okay, so he did. And he developed this pump. You'd have this jar of carbolic acid, and somebody would work the pump up and down as if they were pumping water out of it, and all it would do was spray this fine mist around the patients to kind of scrub the air, kill all the germs, and it would soak the hands of the surgeon. The bandages were soaked in it as well once the wound was sewed back up, and even the sleeves of the coats on the surgeons would be dripping with this stuff. Okay, one of his nurses apparently came to him and said, I have to stop working for you because her hands were all red and sore and cracked because she'd been exposed to this carbolic acid so much. So he developed these big gloves for her to wear to protect her hands, and you could see the impact that wearing gloves in operations had. Now we use latex gloves to stop germs getting out from hands into patients' wounds. Originally, by the sound of it, it was done just to protect a very valued member of the team from leaving him. Okay. And the big proof of it came with the case of somebody who'd broken a leg. And if you broke a leg then, and it was what they call a compound fracture, you can see on the diagram on the top left, that meant that the bone was broken and was also piercing the skin. Right? That meant that when the leg was set, infection would probably get into that, and you'd probably have to have your leg amputated as well. And there was a boy of age 7 who'd been run over by, I think, a horse and cart, and had this. And so he experimented. He reset the leg, dressed the wound with bandages soaked in carbolic acid, and about 6 weeks later, this boy was able to walk out of the hospital fine. Previously, the boy would have lost his leg, okay, or indeed die, okay. What the use of carbolic acid did was had a great effect. It reduced the death rate from something like 46% down to 15% very, very quickly. And people started to copy his methods around Europe as well. Appendectomies, an operation to remove somebody's appendix, which is actually in the torso of the body as well. Somebody performing operation on the heart in the late 19th century, again, would never have been attempted without the presence of carbolic acid to use. Okay. Yet again, there were people that didn't like this idea. I mean, using carbolic spray as an antiseptic, something to kill germs, was expensive. All right. It also increased the amount of time that doctors could operate. And if you increase the time that somebody's operating, you're also increasing the time that they are bleeding to death. Okay. And again, still some surgeons, people in the medical world, just did not accept the idea of germs being in the air, Pasteur's theory. So they couldn't really see the point of cleaning, scrubbing the air at all. Okay. On a side note, he's still around today. I mean, Listerine takes its name from the work of Joseph Lister, but in America, somebody just took his name and copied it to make this, mouthwash that he developed over in America, in Missouri, appealing to people. Okay, I wonder if Lister had ever got any money out of that. I don't know. Okay. And in 1878, Koch, just to go back to the German scientist as well, he himself identified the exact bacteria that carbolic spray was killing. He called it, or the infection it caused, the bacteria, was called septicemia. That's blood poisoning to you and me. That's the kind of stuff that gets around. So the idea of cleaning the air, scrubbing the air, keeping the operating theatre all scrubbed with this stuff, spread around. Okay, and what you find in the 1890s, because Lister himself eventually abandoned carbolic spray, it was just too acidic and too harmful. Okay, but eventually what you find is this thing called aseptic surgery develop, where everything is scrubbed clean. Steam is used to sterilize all the instruments. Hospital theatres are scrubbed clean as well. People start to use rubber gloves, latex gloves and gowns and masks to keep to reduce the possibility of any germs getting from their bodies and the theatre into the patient. Okay, so it's a stepping stone towards what we'd recognize as modern aseptic surgery. Okay. However, there's still one thing that they can't do. They still can't replace any blood that's lost in a patient that's been operated on. I mean, there's various things that go back to Renaissance that show that transfusions are possible, but it wasn't possible at this time on such a large scale to do it because doctors didn't know how to stop the blood clotting when it was stored. Okay, so patients often died through bleeding to death. They couldn't stop that. Okay, and it wasn't really until the Great War, when we've got millions of people killing each other and doctors trying to save lives, that the different types of blood are identified and experiments are done to separate the different components of blood and to be able to store them on ice and to stop them clotting. It wasn't until the Great War in the beginning of the 20th century that particular problem was resolved. Okay. But let's think about it. Why was Joseph Lister important then? He was important because he developed this safer way of performing operations, which proved that you could reduce infection and reduce deaths in the operating theatre. Last thing we're going to look at is the Public Health Act of 1875, just a nice way to bookend it all. Again, it's a law. Just like the 1848 Health Act, it is a law passed by the British government to try and clean up the towns and cities. I probably think of the 1848 one as the little brother. The 1875 one is the big brother, the one that's going to make it all much, much better. Okay. Why did they pass it? Well, there's various reasons. 1867, millions of men, something like 2 million men, working class men, got the vote. So, politicians had to win their votes. They had to do something for people who were suffering poor health in towns and cities. Okay. So, finding some way of securing their vote was a good idea. People were becoming much more intelligent or educated. There was a Health Act passed in 1870. More people could read and write and think for themselves. So, they were able to understand the implications of this act and demand it be done. Okay. Cholera hadn't gone away. There were still outbreaks. Even in the 1860s, there was outbreaks of it. But the government as well had a better understanding of births and death rates, because the census that's taken every 10 years now, that became part and parcel of society. So it had a statistics department in the government which was analysing death rates and had a better understanding. They had a better chance of managing the problem based on statistics. Okay. So yeah, just to summarise, the government wanted votes, population better educated, everybody accepted now that there was a link between sewage and the death rate and cholera, and people believed in it. And of course, people wanted something to be done. Okay, the only people that could do that was the government by making it a countrywide measure. So what was in it? Well, it's compulsory. That's the key word here. Local authorities, your local council up and down the country, had to, by law, provide new homes with a clean water supply. They were legally expected to get rid of sewage and rubbish from the streets. Okay, the sale of food was also cleaned up as well, and a medical officer was set up in each town and district to be in charge of all of this. New homes that were built had to be connected to a main sewer system to make sure that sewage didn't end up in rivers and streams and in cesspits. Okay. Water supply that went into people's homes had to be clean, so you start to see things like reservoirs being built. And this thing called nuisance was identified. Local authorities were charged, expected to clean up the streets of what we would call today rubbish, human waste. A nuisance is what it was called then. Okay. And also local government, if they felt that there was a problem in their local area that was causing a public health risk, they had the right to pass laws to stop these difficulties, these nuisances spreading, and take measures immediately if there are any cases of cholera, rather than letting it just burn itself out. Okay. Why was it important? Like I said, the Public Health Act was important because it made these measures compulsory. 1848, voluntary, not everybody did it, a third did it. Now, every local authority had to take these measures seriously and do them, or else. Okay.
So in the next few slides, what we'll look at is a few examples of how to actually answer the exam questions that you'll see on paper one when you do your actual exams. The first one you'll see to do with medicine through time is this particular one. Okay, and what it asks you to do is to explain one way in which people's reactions to disease were different between the medieval era and the 19th century. This question is a bit unusual because it's asking you to explain one. Well, you don't end up using the word because when you're explaining here, you're just kind of describing really. And it says one way. Well, you're actually right about two different things. Okay. If you were in an exam and you saw this particular question, what I would do is underline some of the key words in here. People's reactions would be something I'd underline because it wants you to tell them what people did, okay, when they encountered disease. Underline medieval era because you're thinking about, the kind of 13th, 14th century, and then comparing that with the 19th century. And there's only 4 marks here, so really you don't want to spend ages doing this particular question. 4 or 5 minutes should be enough, and you don't need to include any kind of structure along the lines of, well, you do, but you don't need to include any kind of explaining or anything like that. Okay, so let's have a look at the kind of framework you would use. In the medieval era, people believed, or they did, whatever it would be. This meant that's the key phrase. You've got to have these two bits of knowledge connected. And do the same thing with the 19th century. However, in this case, by the 19th century, people believed, or in fact they knew in this case, something else. This meant that. That's the other key phrase that you use. This meant that something else. If you put it together, it kind of looks a bit like this. In the medieval era, people believed that God caused disease and illness. This meant that what did they do? Well, they prayed to God for forgiveness. They would, so that He would take away the disease. And really, you're explaining, well, describing what happened during the Black Death. However, by the 19th century, people knew that bacteria existed. Pasteur proved that existence or their existence in 1861. This meant that now you've got this whole world of bacteria open. They're able to develop vaccines and prevent illness and improve public health. Okay, with something like this, when you're talking about bacteria, I would avoid any kind of modern things that we do, like washing hands or hand sanding or anything like that. And it's worth mentioning when you're writing about medicine, personally, I would avoid any kind of phrase that you'd pick up to do with COVID or the pandemic or anything like that, because that's not on the curriculum. It's part of our lives, but it's not on the curriculum, okay? So for an answer like this then, just to come back to it, if you're explaining one way in which people's reactions are different, identify one in the medieval era and say what they did, this meant that, and then differently in the 19th century, what they discovered, what they knew, and then, an example of that as well, okay? 12-mark question is quite straightforward. Okay, this is very clearly asking you to explain. So straight away you should know I've got to use because in my answer. Why there was rapid change. Certainly would underline that when I see it on the page itself. Rapid change in the understanding of illness in Britain in the 19th century. And there's 12 marks here. Okay, you're probably saying to the screen, well, I've got to peel 3 paragraphs here. You've got to peel one about carbolic spray, one about Louis Pasteur, and then another one that you've got to come up with by yourself. That's the telling you to do that, where it says use information of your own. Okay, and if you aim to peel 3 paragraphs, you should have a very good chance of getting 12 marks. Peel 3 paragraphs in there. What do I mean by peel? Whatever the thing you're going to write about is, you're going to have a point at the top. So a line, a sentence at the top of this paragraph. Evidence, 4 or 5 bits of information, features we call them, This demonstrates to the examiner that you've revised, you've got some knowledge, okay? Dates, names, places, descriptions, something like that in a 4 or 5 sentences. And then an explanation. This changed the understanding because, and you've got to say why, okay? Then link it back to the main question, so you kind of end your paragraph and you know that you finished, okay? Let's have a look at one example, okay? Carbolic spray first used by Joseph Lister. Well, good point, okay, but tell me some more. Developed its use 1847. Noticed the smell in his hospital. It smelt like sewage. Read about the flood in Durham. Knew about carbolic acid being used to clean up the streets. Decided to try it in his patient's skin, the bandages. He sprayed the air, trying to scrub it in the operating theatre. Boy left the hospital 6 weeks after having a compound fracture. He was fine. Okay, great. So there's lots of information, lots of own knowledge. But then you've got to explain. This led to a rapid change and improvement because wounds now had a less chance of becoming infected and patient survival rates increased. They went up. Then related back to the question, therefore, carbolic spray led to a change in surgery. Okay. Always use the word because, don't use the word as. If you use as, I find that people tend to go back into describing things again. Okay. So make sure you use that section I've got in blue here, and that you use the word because, so you explain. Okay. Same here I've got with Pasteur. Set out again in different colours. The point in yellow, the evidence in green, the explanation in blue, and then the purple bit, just linking it back to the question itself. Okay. The last point I would include in here would be about Edward Jenner. Now I know officially he kind of makes his discovery in the late 18th century, but all the changes that came about because of him took place then in the 19th century. Okay, so I think it'd be okay to include this in here. Okay, so again, you've got the yellow part is about he led to a rapid change, his discovery led to a rapid change. Describe what he did. You could also include in here about the government making inoculation illegal, including details about it becoming compulsory as well. And this led to a rapid change because he developed a safer way of protecting humans from disease. Okay, and then link it back to the final question. Statement question, the 16 mark question, or 16 marker, whatever you want to call it, is pretty much the same as the 12 marker, but you have a different structure to answer it. I call it a statement question because what you have here is a bold statement. Joseph Lister made the greatest contribution to medicine in the 19th century. What did he? How far do you agree? And it gives you some examples to use. You may use the following your answer: carbolic acid, chloroform, and something else. Okay, that's what it means by refer to information of your own. The way I would do it is to have an introduction to kind of set the scene, get some context about what the problems were in medicine in the 19th century, peel a paragraph about carbolic acid, peel about chloroform, and then peel about something else. Okay, so was it Lister that made the biggest contribution? As you probably remember, he's to do with carbolic acid. Chloroform is to do with James Simpson. Okay, and then you've got to think of another one. And at the very end, what you need to do is to have a paragraph where you sum it up. You have a conclusion where you identify that, you think, yeah, this was one that was the best. Yes, I'm aware that this one was really good. But finally, though, I'm going to conclude and say that this particular one was made the greatest contribution. Okay, that's where you get marks for making a judgment. Okay, so it look a bit like this: introduction, context, what's been going on, what the problems are, peel carbolic acid, peel chloroform, peel another one, and I've given a little structure there about how to conclude, contrast, and conclude. Okay. And to give you an example there of what a conclusion would look like, I disagree that Lister and carbolic acid was the biggest contribution. Louis Pasteur was the best, though. All right, even though Lister found a safer way to make surgical operations or do surgical operations, less people died. It was Pasteur that proved that germs existed in the air in the first place. So the yellow bit is your conclusion. There's a contrasting point, yeah, disagreeing with the main point. And then finally concluding, making it really clear, making your judgment in that conclusion. Okay. Right, I'm going to give you some more questions to do on your own. Okay. Now you may be doing this in a revision session. You may be doing this at home. Have a go at the following questions. Okay. And then you can give them to me to mark, or to your teacher to mark for you. Okay. If you're unsure how to answer those questions, then you just rewind a little bit and look at the examples. Okay. And then you attempt them or carry on with them. Okay. So you've got 3 exam questions. There's a short explain question. Explain one way in which care in hospitals in the years 1250, the C means circa, that's roundabout, to circa 1500, so that's the medieval era, okay, Renaissance era, was different from care in hospitals in the years circa 1700 to 1900. So what changed in terms of medical care, okay, in hospital? You got a 12-mark question about Pasteur and chloroform. Then you've got another question about hospital care between the medieval era and up to the 1900s. Okay, so you're peeling about miasma and Florence Nightingale. Okay, and that's that.